In this comparative study, I will analyze two war films classified under the anti-war subgenre. Lewis Milestone's American film from 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front, referred to as All Quiet in this study, and Elem Klimov's Soviet film from 1985, Come and See. I selected the films based on their contrasting historical and social contexts as well as their contrasting positions within the genre. While All Quiet formulated many of war cinema's conventions, at the time when most genres were only just coming of age, Come and See was an apogee of a 3-decade-long tradition of Soviet war films, the country's most well-established genre. Moreover, the films invite comparison due to the contrasting nature of the conflicts they depict. While All Quiet recounts what John Keegan calls a curiously civilized war, where combatants struggle to muster hatred for their enemy.
No, I don't want to shoot any Englishmen. I never saw one till I came up here.
Come and See portrays the Second World War's race-based mass sadism.
Was nicht должно быть.
Und die Mission wird erfüllt.
War cinema is a unique outlet for a nation's cultural memory because it originates from a deep trauma. Based on this feature, I decided to analyze, with references to cinematography and mise-en-scène, how anti-war films reflect different cultural contexts. All Quiet is set during the First World War and follows German schoolboys and the eventual breakdown of their romantic ideas about combat. Come and See takes place in 1943's Belarus during Nazi occupation and follows Flora, a boy determined to join Belarusian resistance but violently disillusioned with war after he witnesses a series of atrocities. Scholars have identified young recruits who mature through the course of war among defining components of war films. Indeed, both All Quiet and Come and See portray journeys toward premature adulthood. All Quiet begins in an atmosphere of euphoria. Milestone uses deep focus to emphasize harmony between German soldiers and exhilarated civilians. As the camera pulls back into a classroom, the diegetic sounds of the parade blend with the professor's lecture. This effect blurs distinctions between school and militarism. Both groom young men for their role in war. Milestone later associates foreground with background as the energetic blocking of the schoolboys begins to mirror the crowd out in the street. He cements the boys' transition from adolescence to military service, while the sequence's exuberance reflects the idealized post-war rhetoric of the spirit of 1914 and sets the stage for the boys' brutal disillusionment. Klimov similarly depicts the moment of transition, but in contrast to his character's joy at finding a firearm, he foreshadows the menace of war. The filmmaker employs an aerial shot to establish their victim status even before they confront combat. After all, the screen space suggests that war is already an integral part of the landscape. Unlike Milestone, Klimov does not depict a state-sponsored patriotism. He expels the authority figure and subverts the traditional Soviet image of a warrior to avoid romanticizing war. Moreover, his focus reflects Soviet society's growing interest in ordinary individuals. These openings outline the film's contrasting social contexts. The post-Great War rhetoric focused on camaraderie,
Let's all stick together.
while post-Second World War societies placed emphasis on an individual soldier. However, while the filmmakers initially allude to these attitudes to reflect the enthusiasm of young recruits, they later subvert them to develop anti-war themes. In All Quiet, the shift transpires in the boys' loss of individuality.
They're going to be soldiers, and that's all.
Milestone's camera tends to move away from intimate medium shots to objective extreme wide shots, while elements of mise-en-scène, such as uniforms, erase the boys' distinguishing features. Moreover, through montage, the film's recurrent motif, a fallen soldier's shoe, becomes a symbol of the youth's senseless and voiceless deaths, reflecting the film's social context of growing disillusionment with the Great War. Fliora's journey similarly takes him from idealism to trauma. However, Klimov addresses his social context's tendency to emphasize individuals, and to that effect employs subjective mise-en-scène. After Nazi soldiers bombard the resistance camp, the protagonist experiences hearing damage. The sound becomes reflective of Fliora's unsettling sensations, not of the objective reality of the film. As an effect, Klimov's intimate focus does not glorify heroism, but rather deromanticizes individual war experience. Interestingly, as the films progress, they reverse their attention. All Quiet's gaze becomes more subjective, and collective kinetics give way to more intimate compositions. This is particularly evident in a duel shot when Paul contemplates the plight he shares with the French soldier he stabbed to death. Milestone subversively establishes a more intimate bond between enemy soldiers than between soldiers and their superiors. These relationships reflect the socio-historical context of the film, where enemy soldiers frequently fraternized with each other, and many veterans felt that the war polarized classes fighting under a common banner rather than unified them.
Will you obey my orders?
Come and See, by analogy, moves away from subjectivity and towards shared horror. When Nazi soldiers entrap villages' population in a barn, wide shots distribute visual attention between grouped victims. Having released his film on the eve of Gorbachev's glasnost, Klimov confirms his defiance against the romanticized war depiction prevalent in the Soviet cinema under Stalin's and Brezhnev's regimes, and chooses not to conceal the scale of atrocities that inspired his film. Despite these unsettling images, both films satisfy an important feature of an anti-war film. They limit war's visual allure. In All Quiet, soldiers huddled in a bunker experience trauma from audible but invisible shellfire. Milestone effectively portrays a distressing invasion of the soldier's personal space, but does not visualize the intruder. Klimov similarly uses absence to portray war's devastation, but contrary to Milestone, he emphasizes the civilian toll to reflect his film's historical context of unprecedented wartime atrocities. Horror comes not from the presence of the enemy, but from desolation of domestic spaces they leave behind. Like All Quiet, the film limits the visible source of horror in order to avoid war's visual allure, but also, as Fuller notes, not to trivialize the act of genocide. However, Klimov not only limits his protagonist's capacity to see, but also to challenge their plight. Richard Barsim explains that the closed frame implies characters were robbed of their ability to move or act freely. Indeed, Klimov employs this visual motif to establish vulnerability of his characters and their lack of agency. Furthermore, the graphic aesthetic of these recurring static medium close-ups reflects the Soviet cinema's renewed quest for unromanticized memory about the Great Patriotic War. Milestone also uses visual motifs to establish his character's inability to break away from cycles of violence. French soldiers charge at German positions, but they're repelled. Parallel pan shots establish that the roles eventually reverse, and that the loss of lives failed to produce any meaningful change. The maintenance of the status quo despite vast casualties addresses the notion that generals would launch offensives only for a few feet of ground. Finally, the futile violence connects the film's endings. Paul returns to the front after a period of recuperation and becomes the war's final victim. The concluding superimposed images express a shift in the post-war social context, from mythologizing the war toward coming to terms with its impact. It cost a generation. In Come and See, a low-angle positions Flora in power for the first time, but a tracking camera distances itself from the images of defeated oppressors, as if hesitant to proclaim victory. Moreover, when the protagonist rejoins the resistance, a tracking Steadicam indicates that he will not find closure, which reflects Soviet rethinking of the Great Patriotic War, not as a moment of glory, but of human tragedy. All Quiet and Come and See both represent a distinctive type of commemorative war films. Despite tens of years and contrasting cultural memories that separate them, both films reflect on wasted youth. Although their respective emphasis on regular soldiers and on civilians sets the two films apart, both present senseless loss. Most of all, what we see in these films is the very definition of their subgenre. In Elem Klimov's words, they are a warning, a passionate warning against war.